Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Cassie, for introducing us. It's great to have you here. It's great that she invited us to do this presentation, help to put it together. As you logged in, you saw this video playing. Amanda will talk about what's going on here a little bit more, but it's a project we had down at Farm Science Review. And if you notice the cover crops, Amanda will talk about when we get there about how some of them are breaking down over the winter and what we have going on. And there's more to come with that as the winter progresses. So Amanda introduced all of us. Here's our team that's going to be presenting today. The things we're going to cover. So we're going to be talking about some tools for picking out the best cover crops for your farm and operation. Each one's a little bit different. And then we'll get into some starter cover crops, a little bit more depth on those, and for organics, how to maybe terminate them, some challenges and different opportunities with those different cover crops. Tracking winter survival for 2020, the cover crop project down at Farm Science Review. A little bit on the interseeding of cover crops, what we've done down at Farm Science Review and a local producer we're working with. Look at some nutrient retention, what those cover crops are actually retaining and some different management there. And then finish off with a little bit of information that we got from Mark Laux, we'll be presenting on about cover crops for weed control and what we've seen and how they benefit in the weed control realm. So we'll let Sarah start off talking about how to use the cover crop selector tool for Ohio. Sarah's an extension educator up in Paulding County. Thanks, Sarah. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jason. Just a second to switch my slides. All right, are we seeing the right screen?
No, we have your presentation view. I mean, it's fine if you want to present off of that, but I don't think it's what you're going for.
All right, hold on. All right, can you see that one now?
Looks good.
All right, so just a few things that I wanted to take some time to go over. I'm Ohio State's rep for the Midwest Cover Crops Council, and I wanted to go through the newly updated Selector tool. Some of you may have already seen that Selector tool in the past, but we have updated that as of November 2020. We've added some more states. We have updated all the weather profiles for Ohio. We have added some species, some things we did remove. We took away the mixes. And the other thing we did do was make this more mobile friendly so you can access this on your cell phone. So the website for the Midwest Cover Crops Council is mcc.msu.edu/selector tool. And I'll go through those. So when you open that, this is the first screen that you will see when you come to that. There is a third tab across the top that says Selector tool, and so you will choose that. One of the things when you get to that Selector tool is you have the option for row crops and vegetable crops. Unfortunately, we don't have enough research data to have that vegetable crop tool for Ohio for all counties, so that is absent right now. But you can look at all of our different row crops for Ohio. Once you click on row crops, it's going to bring up a screen, and there are different options. The platform looks, again, different than it did before. It will work, again, on a mobile version. So to start, I always tell people, start with your state and then your county that you will be farming in. Sometimes this option is better to look at different fields, but again, we can also use this for education. So I use the example of choosing Ohio and Paulding County. To start off, I tell people this is a great educational aspect. And so if you just choose your state and county, you can look at all the species available for our state and our county. It will eliminate ones that are not good for necessarily your county, but it's a very basic option. You can start here just as education. This is tied to a research model. And so when you look at that across the side, there are some options that you can click on each one of the species with the blue highlighting, and it will bring up another screen for you. With those blue species, this is again where you can do your research on the basics, but there's so much more available in our cover crop tool selector. Again, it shows links. It will show if you are based in the Western Lake Erie Basin, maybe there's some limitations of some of the species. One thing that I do caution people on is this is based on general information. If there is a specific program such as a QUIP or a soil and water program, and you need to look at your different seeding rates, those are not changed in this selector tool. Again, it's general information. But I think people need to go a little more in depth. You can look at the display by grouping the cover crops, or you can look at them just in alphabetical order. If you group those, they'll split into your brassicas, your legumes, and add those different things. One thing that is new, and it floats around on the screen, if you change any options, you always need to use the updated results button, and I've circled that on the screen for you to see. So most people want more in depth when they're using this cover crop tool selector. And so what I recommend is starting with one goal. One of the nice options with this, you can go in any order, but I think goals are one of the first things to start with. And so when you look at that goal, they give you options such as it's a drop-down menu, and they can give you things like erosion fighter, mechanical harvest forage value, good grazing, grain seed harvest value, interseeding with the cash crop, lasting residue, nitrogen scavenger, nitrogen source, quick growth, soil builder, and weed fighter. The one thing that I also want people to understand is my definition of soil builder might be different than your definition of soil builder. The definitions in the cover crop tool selector are tied to the Managing Cover Crops Profitably guide. And so while I might think a soil builder is only going to build organic matter, the definition is a little different. This resource that it is tied to, again, is that Managing Cover Crops Profitably 3rd edition. This is a free download. It's available through SARE, or the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Network. Again, you can actually purchase that book. It's one that I recommend that people keep on hand. If you purchase that, it's $19 plus your shipping. But back to our goals. You start with one goal. And again, understanding that key and that sort order is important with this new tool selector. The default is it sorts in the order of excellent to poor, 4 being excellent, 0 being poor. And it will then put those, every single one that's marked as a 4, it only sorts those in alphabetical order. And so if you chose a goal of erosion fighter, like I have in my example, those goals, again, by all the choices of number 4 and then 3, 2, 1, but again, alphabetical order for all rated. It doesn't mean that winter barley is better than winter cereal rye, as they're both rated at a 4. One of the things that is new when you look at those goals is the addition of a snowflake. A snowflake just means beside a species that there is a frost seeding option. Other things with your goals, you can add a second and a third goal, so a maximum of 3. When you add a second goal, it adds a second column next to each species. Again, it resorts those in order by the combination of both of your goals. For example, if I used erosion fighter and soil builder, it would pull different species up to the top. I pulled one in the middle just so you could see that there is a color change, and if you are colorblind, you can see that shading difference between a 4 and a 3. Other things that it shows, when you get to the side chart, and which you'll see on the next slide, you can see some of the reliable establishment, whether it's a freeze option where that that species would freeze out. The one thing is, if you're going to add a second or a third goal, you need to put that add goal with the plus, and then making sure that you look at those options. One thing that I do caution people on is if you do change that and it shows that current cash crop options and it shows drainage, you haven't added any of those things in. So these species are based on just, here's my goals that I want. Again, like I said, you don't have to do goals. You can go in a different order. You could say, here's my cash crop. And by choosing a cash crop, you would actually add in your cash crop. You would add a planting date, which is just an approximation, and a harvest date, which is an approximation. And again, the more information you give, if you combine goals and cash crops, the more information you will get and the more specific for the cover crops that will work. So this one, if you said, I'm going to plant soybeans approximately, here's what cover crops might work in that list. The other option to add is drainage options. And so some people start with this one and they say, I have a new piece of land, I'm in this county in Ohio, and here's what my drainage is. I'm having issues with drainage. One thing that I do caution people is that just because it says the cover crop species works for this characteristic, such as drainage, doesn't mean that if you don't have other things right with your soil health, that these cover crop species will necessarily grow. But again, we look at those different options as very poorly drained, somewhat poorly drained, moderately well drained, excessively drained, if it's a muck soil, or muck saturated or muck well drained. And then it will ask you flooding options. One thing that does add, if you say I'm very poorly drained or poorly drained, it will give you the option to add in, is the field tiled or is it not? Again, that's a yes and no question. The next thing that I did want to show is if you forget which goals as you're looking at your chart, and maybe you've added other things, it will start to show the black bar is the current cash crop that is growing. And so that will shade in when you have a cash crop growing. Other things that you will start to see in this chart as we look at that priority order is the start of a fly-free date. And so sometimes if you were using, let's just say winter barley as a cash crop, not a cover crop, that there's a fly-free date that you need to worry about. With that, sometimes those species will have insect issues if planted before that date. The green bars show basically every 15 days where it's a reliable establishment. The yellow bars, again, show freeze, moisture risk to establishment. And then again, the rating. Now, this is just the ratings. A lot of times you'll need a little more information than what you see here. And so, again, those goals beside each one will show you the 2 goals you chose. Now, once you are down to the point where I need a little more information, again, just like at the beginning, if you were using this for education, once you add in goals, you add in drainage, you add in cash crop, the results, when you click on each species, brings you a separate screen. And one thing we did change is it brings up a new tab completely with this. This will print different than what you see here. They are drop-down type menus. But again, if I were to choose winter cereal rye as one of my options, I can look at all this information. It does give me more. It will show me everything from seeding rate, whether I'm broadcasting or drilling that. It will tell me, what are all the characteristics of this species. And so we've tried to make this easier. It's more printer friendly. And so this is just one of the tools to put in your toolbox. I know we're going to save questions for the end, and if people stay on and they want to see the actual live version of this, I'll have an opportunity to share that at the end. But with that, if you have any questions on the cover crop tool selector, my contact information is here, but I will turn this over to Rachel Cochran, who is our next presenter.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me get this shared here. Okay, can you see this?
Yes, you're good, Rachel.
Okay, cool. So as Sarah said, I'm Rachel. I'm the Water Quality Extension Associate. And I'm going to talk about cover crop options for organic growers. So before we begin to talk about some different cover crop species, it's worth mentioning a couple of considerations for choosing a species. First, what are the goals you want to accomplish? Why are you planting a cover crop? For example, are you wanting to fix nitrogen into your field? Do you want to suppress weeds? Are you trying to prevent erosion? The goals you choose will affect which cover crop you'll want to plant. The next consideration is simply, do you want the species to winter kill? And the last consideration depends on your comfort level with having to terminate a species. Some are going to be difficult to terminate without chemicals and may require multiple methods of mechanical termination, mowing, tillage, crimping, etc. And choosing a species may depend on how much effort you want to put into the termination of that species. If one of your goals is nitrogen fixation, you may want to plant a legume, whether it be in a mix or planted by itself. First, we're going to talk about a couple of hardy legumes, which would be used if you wanted to fix nitrogen and wanted the species to survive the winter. So all four of these species provide around the same amount of nitrogen, anywhere between 70 and 180 bushels or pounds to the acre, depending on several factors. So the first hardy legume on our list is winter pea. This species does not tolerate flooding or low fertility soils. It ranks very good when it comes to its ability to compete with weeds. Its deep roots make it a good soil builder and erosion fighter, and it also works well in cover crop mixes. However, it can harbor sclerotinia and fusarium root rots. Winter pea is a hardy legume, but can be winter killed if you plant it early, which may be a good thing if you don't want to terminate it in the spring. Winter pea can also be terminated with tillage, but multiple passes will be required. It can be mowed or crimped at full bloom, but crimping is the most variable termination method and may not be as effective as tillage. Next, we have sweet clover. Unlike winter pea, sweet clover has a high tolerance for flooded conditions. Excellent root penetration is another benefit, which makes it a good erosion fighter and soil builder. It's ranked good for quick growth and lasting residue as well. One downside of choosing sweet clover are its hard seeds. They may reseed in years to follow, making it difficult to control. But tillage is the recommended method for termination, but you'll probably need to do multiple passes to fully terminate it. Sweet clover also poses a risk to livestock with the potential for bloat or coumarin toxicity. Hairy vetch grows best on well-drained soils, similar to winter pea. Hairy vetch also has hard seed characteristics, giving it the potential to be hard to control. However, it's a very good soil builder, erosion fighter, and weed fighter. It's ranked good for grazing and quick growth, and it can be terminated with tillage, mowing, or crimping at full bloom. Lastly, we have crimson clover. Like winter pea, it does not tolerate flooded conditions. Crimson clover ranks excellent for grazing and very good as a soil builder and erosion fighter. Another benefit is its ability to compete with weeds, but if allowed to reseed, it can become a weed itself. Crimson clover also may be difficult to terminate with tillage, so multiple passes will be required, but mowing is another option for termination. And from left to right, the photos are showing winter pea, then sweet clover, hairy vetch, and crimson clover all the way to the right. For our hardy cereals, it's important to note that all three of these species, rye, wheat, and triticale, have a high weed potential if they aren't completely terminated. Because these three species are grasses, they're all rated excellent for preventing erosion. In addition, they all have long-lasting residue and are excellent for grazing. All can be terminated with tillage, mowing, or roller crimping. Let's start with rye. Rye has a good flood tolerance, so it's suited for the winter. It's excellent at competing with weeds, and it has allelopathic traits, which further its weed control abilities. Because of its fibrous root system, rye is an excellent nitrogen scavenger, but it can be a host for penetrans root lesion nematode. Triticale also has a good flood tolerance, is allelopathic, and very good at competing with weeds. It's a very good nitrogen scavenger, also due to its fibrous root system. Mowing may terminate this species if it's done at the right time. Mowing at full bloom can terminate it, but mowing before then may just cause more tillering of the plants. Wheat, unlike rye or triticale, has a poor flood tolerance. It can be effective at competing with weeds, but doesn't have the allelopathic traits that the other two species do. Its root system allows it to be a very good nitrogen scavenger, and like rye, it can be a host for Penetran's root lesion nematode. All three species are rated either very good or excellent for their tolerance of low fertility soils as well. And the photo in the bottom right-hand corner is comparing wheat on the left, rye in the middle, and triticale on the right. Lastly, we have our winter-killed species, which you may be interested in if you'd prefer to not have to terminate your cover crops. Oats are a grass species, so they have fibrous roots, which help its ability to fight erosion and to scavenge for nutrients. Oats have a good tolerance for flooding in low fertility soils, and they're ranked excellent for weed competition and allelopathy, as well as grazing. However, oats are slow to release nitrogen unless they're terminated at 12 to 18 inches tall. Oats also can be a host for Penetran's root lesion nematode, like some of the other grass species. Radish is a species that has good heat, shade, and drought tolerances. It ranks excellent for weed competition in allelopathy and is very good nitrogen scavenger. Radish's ability to push deep into the soil makes it ideal for loosening topsoil, but should be included in a mix to alleviate erosion concerns. Radish can bolt under certain conditions and become a serious weed if allowed to go to seed, and does have an odor during decay. Cowpeas have an excellent tolerance for heat and low fertility soils. They're a very good nitrogen source, but they must be planted in early June to reach their full nitrogen potential. They're very good for grazing and for competing with weeds as well. However, they can compete with your cash crop if they're not completely terminated, and they can be a host for soybean cyst nematode. Buckwheat has a very fibrous, dense root system, making it ideal for building soil and scavenging for nutrients. Buckwheat has an excellent tolerance for low fertility soils and is an excellent weed fighter. It can self-seed, so it's very easy to grow, but has the potential to become a weed. It's also very attractive to beneficial insects and is highly attractive to Japanese beetles, which may be an issue. And finally, sorghum sudan has excellent heat and drought tolerance. Unfortunately, it can cause prussic acid and or nitrate poisoning in livestock if grown under certain conditions. Sorghum sudan is an excellent nitrogen scavenger and has long-lasting residue. It's also a very good soil builder, erosion fighter, and weed fighter. One resource you may find helpful is this link to the Rodale Institute website. The topic of the article is cover crops for organic no-till systems, and it includes helpful charts for hardy, semi-hardy, and tender legumes, as well as hardy, semi-hardy, and tender non-legumes. The charts include information like seeding rates, depths, inoculants, timing, and more. The link is included at the bottom of the presentation as well, and I will drop that in the chat box. And that wraps up my presentation for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Amanda's going to be our next presenter on what we have going on down at Farm Science Review with the cover crops and how they are terminating and changing through the winter.
All right, thanks, Jason. Appreciate you guys joining us here today. Hope you find some useful information. You saw that drone video at the beginning looking at the cover crops when they were growing, and then here just a couple days ago what they looked like. So we're going to look at that a little bit more in detail. And this was something where it was kind of an accident there at the Farm Science Review plots, because our intention was to look at cover crop survival with different herbicide applications, but we didn't have any rain after those So after the herbicide application, so they didn't activate. So what we ended up with was a really great stand of a lot of different cover crops. So the trial here, you can see what it looks like. We've got several different varieties here. This was taken on 10/28/2020, so the end of October. And we've got forage turnip, clover, annual ryegrass, hairy vetch, radish, canola, turnip, sorghum. We've got another clover in there that you can't see. There's oats on the other side, which in the drone footage you may have seen, those have died off as well. So a lot of different variety here, and what we decided to do is just make the best out of the situation, and we want to track these throughout the winter to see how they winter kill. We had so much growth on them having planted them on July 30th, and not having the ability really to get together to do field days and things like that this year. Okay. So here's the temperatures that we've seen essentially since that picture was taken. We hadn't had any hard freezes up to that point. We did have some light frosts, but no killing frosts. So from that point forward, the beginning of November until the end of December, we only had about 5 days where the max temperature didn't get above freezing. But you can see the lows. We've had several days. That black bar indicates the 32 degrees there. We've had several dates below 32 degrees. In the average, we've had about 4 periods where the averages dipped or stayed below freezing for 3 to 5 day period there. So most of those occurring in December. So that kind of gives you a heads up. And we've had from that October picture, we've had rain, we've had freezing rain, we've had snow, a few snows. So they've really seen a little bit of everything at this point. So that first picture was on 10/28, and I came back on 11/1 and took this picture. This is a reverse order, so the forage turnips are now on the right-hand side of your screen there. And this was, we got to 27 degrees, I believe it was. I think it was that night, that 10/28, or maybe it was the night right before here on 10/30. But this is kind of how they look after that we dipped down to 27 degrees. So still fairly green, but you can definitely see some burn on the leaves. And then on 11/19, hadn't had a lot of cold weather since that first freeze. And then this was taken on December 31st. So again, rain, sleet, snow, anything but hail pretty much. And you can start to see a lot of these, the radishes, pretty much completely wilted, but the hairy vetch is still green, ryegrass, and the clovers. And these forage turnips, if they hadn't been planted in July and not had a lot of good growth on them, they'd probably look a lot more degraded as well. And you can see the sorghum is completely dead as well. Here's a couple, we've got a turnip here and a radish. These were taken 12/31 as well, so you can kind of see what they'll look like. And then because we didn't have farm science review in person, we had a lot of open area in the plots, and we just planted some different mixes and stuff. And this is one of those mixes that has a lot of variety in it. This was taken on 10/28 as well. And then this is what it looked like a few days ago. So it starts to break down fairly quickly. We've got a couple more months here of winter to go, so we'll be interested to see you know, what it really, how it progresses and how rapidly. Here's one of the radishes. And then this, I thought this was kind of a neat looking picture. Tops winter kill, you can kind of see some of them starting to shrivel up a little bit, but they're still definitely there. All right, so with that, I'm just going to say stay tuned. We've posted a video on YouTube, if you haven't seen it yet, talking a little bit more about what we have going on. And in that, we promise to update you guys throughout the winter. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll get another video out, dive a little bit deeper into, you know, how thick are those tubers, those radishes and turnips, what are they looking like? And then follow up, you know, right before planting time to see what all of these species look like as well.
All right, thanks, Amanda. We have just a few more topics to cover here quickly. Just some other projects that we have going on at Ohio State that we wanted you guys to be aware of. So we're starting to do some work with some different producers, and we did some work down at Farm Science Review with interseeding into growing corn. This is a local producer here in Crawford County that I was working with. He's not organic, but he's trying to minimize herbicide usage. And he was planting various cover crops using that herd seeder into the corn. He actually cultivates he doesn't do it on all of his acres, just a small portion for one landlord that he works with. It actually worked very well. It's not the ideal method. I think if you're going to cover a lot of acres, you're going to need something a lot bigger than that herd seeder. It only holds about 25 pounds of seed. It also doesn't have a good way to shut off at the end of the field. So lots of challenges there, but a very good tool to get started and look at interseeding into that growing crop, since he was already making that cultivation pass, to look at how those cover crops are going to interact with the corn and how they're going to interact with weed control. Another project we had going down at Farm Science Review was using the university's small plot interseeder to actually plant into growing corn. We planted a lot of different species here. The project was twofold. It was looking at survivability and ability to interseed various species into the corn and what happens. But it was also a herbicide project. While that's not important to you guys, we were looking at herbicide rates and then how the crop would grow through the herbicides. Kind of like the back herbicide plot, though, we didn't see a lot on the herbicide front, but we did see a lot on how those cover crops would grow. So moving into harvest, this is up there where the cover crop was planted with the cultivator. Some different shots and what you could see at harvest time. So the radishes where the corn was really good. This field, that picture in your top left where you see some really small radishes, that spot in the field went about 260 bushels. So you had really small radishes in there. They grew a little bit in that corn canopy, but the dense corn canopy pretty much shaded them out. So you didn't, at 260 bushels, that's nothing to think we had any sort of competition from those cover crops that were causing an issue of stealing nutrients from that corn crop. But down there on the bottom right, you see some really thick radish growth. So if you think about a crop, sometimes there's some spots where the corn doesn't grow very well. And those spots are usually completely full of weeds. Even in a good herbicide program, a lot of times you'll have a weed issue where you have a thin crop. By interseeding that cover crop into the growing corn crop, those radishes created a dense canopy and there was not any weeds to be found. That spot probably went less than 50 bushels to the acre. It's small enough, it's hard to tease out. I mean, that was probably 5 bushel right in that spot, but hard to tease out on the yield monitor what its yield actually was. But you can see a very dense stand of radishes there where the corn was thin. So it did a very good job of controlling weeds. It may or may not have taken a little bit off of that corn yield, but compared to the weed challenges you'll see in the future, I would say the cover crop was a very small competitor. There was clover planted in another section of that field. You can see the clover just kind of growing very small underneath the corn canopy where we had a really good corn yield. That was red clover used. And it looks like, you know, that's going to has a nice start to produce some nitrogen for next year. That corn crop will go to soybeans, so we really don't need the nitrogen. But if it's a cover that grows well, it won't hurt anything. So moving back down to Farm Science Review here, just before harvest, you can see the radishes growing. They grew pretty well in most places we planted them, and the red clover grew very well. Most of the other cover crops, we actually had all the same species that Amanda showed in her presentation planted in the corn. A lot of them did not grow, not due to the herbicide, because we had a patch without herbicide, but due to how dry it was and the good corn stand, they just weren't competitive. But the red clover and the radishes did well. They competed. They were a useful investment because we had our cover crop at the end of the day. Here's just a few more pictures from there. You can see a few other things grew, maybe not well in all places. So we had annual ryegrass in there. A lot of producers are concerned about it because it can become a weed very easily. In an organic system, if you use some strong tillage along with annual ryegrass, it's controllable as long as it doesn't go to seed. But the annual ryegrass grew. Cereal rye did not grow well. There was a little bit of hairy vetch that grew, but it didn't grow well. And then moving on into harvest. So what's there to protect our soil through the winter? If you think about a cornfield, you have a lot of barren ground between those rows usually. But if you look here down at Farm Science Review, you can see our cover crops are there between the rows. They're still green. This was taken there at the end of December when Amanda took pictures. The red clover, where we had 3 rows, looks like it's got a pretty nice covering on the ground. And then the radishes, they still have good ground protection. They might not be the best at having a huge root system, but they have that leaf mass to break up those raindrops that are coming down and causing erosion, and they will help to slow down erosion moving through that cornfield. So we definitely can see some advantages in a cover crop system that it looks like we could do this interseeding and not hurt our growing crop. So moving into some other projects we have, we're doing some work looking at summer annuals, winter annuals, and oats and how many nutrients they retain. Actually, we're also using it as a forage project, looking at their abilities to use these cover crops in a forage system. So we have some of those summer annual trials here. On the left, you have sorghum. In the middle is Sudan grass, and then oats. And then the one that looks really poor there on your right was a rye crop planted in July. It's a winter annual. It's really not the time to plant that. And you can see we have a humongous weed pressure issue if we don't get that cover crop established. So when it comes to weed control, establishment is really important. So to kind of look at this trial and think about what nutrients are going to be retained, one of the really important things if you want to retain nutrients that you're going to see on this slide is you have to have tonnage. If we don't have biomass, we don't have nutrient retention. So there was 100 pounds of nitrogen applied to this trial. And you can see here the sorghum Sudan had a 2.5 ton yield. That was the highest. That's dry matter. It only actually took up about 52 pounds of that nitrogen we applied. It didn't need it. It was not turning that nitrogen into crude protein, which is the main place that nitrogen goes in the plant. It did retain into its biomass about 32 pounds of P2O5 and 180 pounds of potassium. And as you think about as that plant breaks down, it should retain that until it decomposes, or as it decomposes, it'll release different amounts of that. The nitrogen and potassium are released through decomposition. It'll actually release a lot of this potassium, though, right away. So potassium is very water soluble in the plant to move back into the soil. So once it dies, that first rainfall event will move a large amount of potassium out of the plant into the soil, but it will continue to retain that phosphorus and nitrogen. Oats, 2.2 tons, but it was a very high. Oats does a good job of converting nutrients during the vegetative stage into crude protein. So that nitrogen amount, it actually had about 118 pounds of nitrogen per acre that it retained. So a little bit more than what we actually applied. So it actually scavenged some of the nitrogen out of the soil. It retained about 34 pounds of P2O5 in its biomass and 227 pounds of potassium. And as we get down here, our lower yielding crops, sorghum, only 1 3/4 tons. It didn't retain anywhere near as much potassium or nitrogen, only about 50 pounds. So the more biomass we have, we definitely are retaining more crop or more of those nutrients that we want to keep for next year's crop. So if you think about summer annuals in this trial, if you're going to put summer manure on, you have to look at a crop. It's a cover crop that'll actually retain that nitrogen for you. And if you think about oats and go back to Amanda's video, That oats crop had a very dense stand, and it was retaining all the nitrogen we put on. It did a very good job of taking that up, scavenging some more nitrogen. And as it decomposes, there'll be a small amount of that, not real heavy left in spring, but it'll retain those nutrients a little bit better probably than what the sorghum Sudan or other crops in this study did for your crop the next fall. We also have a project looking at oats as a cover crop, planted anywhere from July into mid-September, both for cover crops and forage. And we're finding it's very important if you want a stand of oats that you have nitrogen present to get that crop going. So in this picture, you can see here in the middle, this was 0 nitrogen applied, and then you have 50 pounds and 100 pounds of nitrogen. 50 and 100, if it's planted in July and August, doesn't seem to make a difference which rate you'd use, but it has a big difference for September, mid-September, late September planted oats on the growth of that crop. And if you look here in the middle, don't have a good picture of it, but you could walk down through there and you could actually find weeds growing in with the oats where we didn't have enough nitrogen applied, exact same seeding rate, but the oats crop needed the nitrogen to put on the biomass and crowd out those weeds. So in this trial, there was 50 pounds of nitrogen put on. It was following a wheat crop that was not the greatest, so there's probably a little bit of residual nitrogen in the soil. We didn't test for it. But this was mid-September planted oats, and some things you see, by increasing our nitrogen rate, we really increase the biomass. So if you're looking to grow biomass, looking to grow organic matter, we have to grow that crop. So we had 1 ton with 50 pounds of nitrogen, a little 2 3/4 of a ton applied with 100 pounds of nitrogen. Again, if you're going to put that manure on and you want to tie up that nitrogen, oats could be a good crop to grow. The oats will pull that nitrogen out of the manure. Say you have chicken litter to spread, or you're getting swine manure from somewhere. That could be a great way to soak up that nitrogen, help retain it in biomass to hopefully be available for next year's crop. Because of that dry matter yield, we also had about 46 pounds of P2O5 retained and held in that crop, and 225 pounds of potassium. Winter annual grasses. So this is looking at oats, or not oats, wheat, rye, and triticale, and seeing how they do at retaining nutrients. In this trial, there's actually 50 pounds of nitrogen put on. Again, we're looking at that as a forage alternative crop too, not just as a cover crop. So we're putting some nitrogen on to increase growth. We didn't have a 0 nitrogen check, but some other trials have shown us that these winter annuals, putting a little nitrogen on, definitely helps them to put on biomass. And that biomass, as we'll see here in a little bit, is what helps crowd out the weeds and helps with weed control. So when the crop was harvested in the boot stage, we had somewhere between 35 and 45 pounds of nitrogen retained in the biomass. When we got up there into the heading stage, triticale got up to about 55 pounds of nitrogen. But they're not retaining a lot of phosphorus. About 5 to 10 pounds of phosphorus is all that's being retained in the biomass. We don't have as much tonnage for one thing, and winter annuals don't retain quite as much phosphorus in their biomass or in their forage because it's not as available in the soil. They're just, the way they're designed, they don't need quite as much phosphorus. But we can definitely see some differences in tonnage here, which could be differences in the organic matter potential to build your soil. Looking at the termination date, if you terminated them at just in the boot there, Feeks 10, there's about 1 ton, 1 1/4 tons. If you waited to terminate until the head was emerged, you're up to 1.5 to 2 tons of biomass there. So then when we look at cover crops for weed control, this is some data from a published paper by Wallace et al. These slides are borrowed from Mark Laux. So some things they're finding, if you come down here to this red highlighted box and just look at cereal rye compared to the control, we have a lot smaller. The mare's tail that are present, they're all very small. We definitely shift that down to rosettes that are less than about 2.5 centimeters, where if you look at the control, we're all the way up to about 7.5 centimeters on some of those rosettes. But species definitely matters. Cereal rye at 120 pounds per acre, so a pretty high planting rate. You saw the lowest population decline. On average, about an 80% decline. If you go to oats and vetch, hairy vetch, you're down to about 55% population decline. They all helped with weed control, but the higher, the denser that stand, as this graph shows, the more biomass you have, the better control you have, whether it's this one's looking at Palmer amaranth or mare's tail, whichever weed it is, there's definitely a relationship to the amount of cover we have and the amount of weed control we get. The average cover crop, unfortunately, though, falls right about here at about 5,000 pounds of biomass. So for Palmer, you're looking at about 50% control. If Palmer or weeds like Palmer are your goal to control with your cover crop, you have to get really high biomass, up here almost 5 tons or better, which is hard to do if you want 75% control of that crop without tillage or herbicide intervention. So cover crops for weed control, the ability of the cover crop to reduce emergence of winter annual weeds, provide that suppression is very variable, and it's very much dependent on the cover that we have. So what weed species are present, the time those weeds emerge also matters, the timing of termination of the cover crop, and the weather that we have. And when you think about the biomass, you also have to think about the timing of when that crop would have been planted. We get a lot more biomass the earlier we plant most of these cover crops in the fall. Does anybody have any questions as we wrap up here today?
I'd like to hear from some of our growers if they're still on, you know, just what, if they've had some experience crimping as a way of terminating their cover crops and if that's been successful or not. Not hearing anything. Is anyone, Gerald, would you mind talking a little bit about the trials that you had done on the on West Badger on cover crops?
I'm not sure which ones you're talking about. We really had a couple of them. The one I can recall offhand, not having the data in front of me, was looking at frost-seeded red clover into wheat versus not having any, and then coming back with a summer cover crop versus just leaving it fallow. And what my data was just 1 year's data. What it showed was I think it was a relationship to nitrogen, but the yields on the frost-seeded red clover were probably 5 bushel better than the summer seeded cover crop. But both of those were greatly larger than leaving it fallow. I think it was like 156 for the clover, 150, 151 for the cover crop, and then with nothing and just fallow, we dropped down to 115 or something. So it looked like a nitrogen relationship, but it just goes to show, from my opinion, that if you ever have a wheat crop, then you should be planting a red clover or something in there, frost seeding it just to have something growing once the wheat is done.
Thanks, Gerald.
Yeah, this is Eli Dean. I'm a grower in North Central Ohio. And as for the question about crimping, that's something we're considering doing in the future, but we haven't tried it yet, partially because we don't have the equipment, but we also are kind of concerned about the reliability of it. So when it's come to deciding how to terminate crops, we've been using just tillage or mowing or a combination of those two because it seems more reliable.
Do we have some trials at Ohio State on like crimping and, that success rate that maybe we could share? I mean, I think that's something we may be able to help with because, you don't want to invest in equipment that isn't going to get the job done. I don't know, is there anything out there like that?
Yeah, we actually do have some trials going on. Most of them are up in Northwest Ohio, being led by Eric Rieker. And they're looking at crimping of mostly cereal rye. Those trials, they're not summarized over multiple years, but each year's reports are published in eFields. I think he's had trials in at least the 19 and 20 issue, maybe the 18. I don't remember if there was any done in 18,
Okay.
but definitely show that it works, but it also has some shown that there's a little bit of time dependence there to get it right. And of course, in the organic system, if you don't time it right and it doesn't work, you don't have the ability to come back and clean up with a herbicide like you do if you're using it in a non-organic chemical-based system. There's definitely some concern there, and added challenges of getting it right.
Yeah, that's exactly the concern that we've had. We've seen issues, not on our farm, but other people that attempt to terminate cereal rye when it's quite tall with rolling it, and then it doesn't work, and then trying to remedy that with tillage takes weeks, many weeks of many different passes. And in the spring, we are generally pressed for time as it is.
This is Dave Shively. I would, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Dave.
I would concur with both of those guys. I think you need to get your weed pressure somewhat under control before you try these roller crimping and get things done. Like I said, once you roll them down, your limitations to herbicides, weed control just goes down to zero almost. What you can try do. I would also make a comment to on the hairy vetch. I would shy away from that because that can become a very tough weed if not under control, and go to a checkling vetch. I think it'd be a much more suitable cover crop.
Thanks, Dave. Are there some other cover crops that you guys have tried that were just total disasters, out of curiosity?
Sure. This year we tried a number of different cover crops that were, I don't know what you want to call it, co-planted or whatever. They were planted at the same time that we planted our corn. We were trying to select legumes that would fix some nitrogen, but a number of them were pretty awful this year. The year turned off dry, so I guess that's probably part of it. But we had iron and clay cowpeas. They did okay, but the lentils we tried planting, the yellow field peas, and also we tried planting some clovers, and all of them pretty much fell on their face this year.
Thanks. Were you able to go back in and maybe reseed part of that to kind of get something down?
We did part of it. We reseeded with some buckwheat later in the year, and I think there was a brassica in there as well. And those did okay. Of course, the buckwheat grew. The buckwheat always grows, but it was kind of disappointing. I think in a normal moisture environment, unlike what we had this year, we would have had a lot more success, especially with reseeding. We actually abandoned our plan to interseed after pollination and on part of the fields because it was just so dry. And, you know, when you're not even able to drill it in, we figured the likelihood of the cover crops actually catching would be so low that it wasn't worth the money.
Thanks, Eli. Any other questions, comments out there for panelists or just in general?
We just keep experimenting.
Yep. What kind of trials would be helpful? You know, you mentioned the crimping experiments, but are there other things that maybe we could do on our research ground here at Ohio State that would be helpful? Kind of limit your losses? In particular for cover crops, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah,
the,
this is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I guess the big thing I'd like to know is what cover crops could you plant after wheat to really get some good nitrogen fixation in the soil for a following corn crop. With nitrogen being a big limiting factor on yield for organic production, I think that'd be some good trials to look at.
Good. Thanks. Anything else?
Yeah, I would like to see some more spring termination, tillage termination methods. Because depending on what crop you have growing, we have a couple different options. I know some people think of tillage as all being the same, but we have a lot of different options when it comes to what types of tillage to use. And sometimes it can be difficult to decide whether you need to run a disc through something or a field cultivator if you can get it, or, you know, just how to decide what tillage implement to take through to terminate those cover crops in the spring.
And then
How do
to
those,
kind of
oh, go ahead.
like build on top of that, I don't know if you guys look at kind of what I've been watching some Gary Zimmer videos, and I've always been interested in what he does with called I think a rotavator, where he'll plant alfalfa and then hit it with the rotavator and then plant corn following the alfalfa crop. So that kind of ties into the nitrogen fixation as well as the spring tillage methods. So
I didn't know he was using a rotavator. I knew he was using a chopper and a disc.
okay, so I might have been mistaken there, but I was just kind of interested in his techniques and seeing some university trials behind some of that.
He seems to have that down as a pretty good system. I think it all dependent on soil, your soil, what kind of soil you have, and weed pressure. He's got pretty good biomass to keep weed pressure down.
I'm curious how easy it is to till up those turnips and how much they die back. That might be something interesting to see out at that plot at Farm Science Review. Does it break down enough that it isn't a problem?
That'll all be, as Amanda alluded to. I mean, yes, they'll break down really well probably, but that's all going to be coming soon. Stay tuned as we continue to produce some videos following those through the rest of the winter and into early spring as we move towards planting. But yes, I mean, most winters, those will pretty much break down to nothing.
Be interesting to, well, hopefully we get some colder weather, but I doubt they've done a whole lot so far.
Dave may have a comment on there, but some experience with the turnips last year. The bigger ones broke down. It's the really small ones, the ones that are probably $half size or so that didn't get very big that made it through last winter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we had some purple top turnips a good number of them actually make it through the winter last year. If we went out in about February, they looked like they were all mush and were pretty well done, but they came back in the spring. We even had some that we chopped in half with the disc, and they kept on growing. It was very surprising.
Wow.
Yeah, could be a problem. Any other comments, questions? Give you a minute. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and I thank you to our panelists for all the good stuff they shared. And I'd just like to share real quick that we do have another cover crop session coming up in February. This is part of the Ohio State Soil Health Series, which is, I think, going to be pretty good. We do have 2 more sessions coming up this month as part of our organic seminar series. So next week we have transition Q&A with Julia Barton, and on the 20th we have a session on manure analysis. So hopefully you will join us for some of those. And the Soil Health Series, it is free, but you do need to register in advance. And we have Hans Koch coming in, and Rick Clark a little later in the series. So some speakers of interest for many of us. And that's all I have today, but thank you so much for joining us. And if you have any suggestions for the future, you can give me a shout out. But thanks, and I hope everyone enjoys.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Enjoyed the comments at the end. And thank you, panelists. That was great.
Thanks
We'll
for
have a
having us.
recording of this up fairly soon.